In 1953, during cataloging work on a backlog of unprocessed tablets at the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, a small fragment is said to have been pulled from a crate of materials originally excavated decades earlier at the site of ancient Shuruppak. According to secondary research accounts that have not been independently verified through mainstream archaeological publications, the fragment had been sitting unexamined since its excavation in the 1920s, mixed in with administrative and agricultural records that made up the bulk of that find. What separated it, according to this account, was a single line near its edge that a junior cataloger flagged before moving on to the next item. A reference to a fixed number repeated 3 times in a context that did not match grain totals or property records. That number, according to this account, was 100. The fragment was reportedly assigned the field designation SH1107 and set aside for further review. Review that, according to the account, did not happen for another 22 years. What SH1107 is claimed to describe, in a translation that did not surface in circulated form until the late 1970s, is not a story about death in the way ancient flood narratives or underworld journeys typically describe it. According to this interpretation, it is something closer to a technical decision, an account of a specific deliberation in which a maximum span was assigned to human life, and a specific reason given for why that number was chosen. Some researchers who have engaged with this proposed translation argue that the text identifies by title, if not by personal name, who made that decision. These are substantial claims, drawn from a translation and an account that have not been verified through mainstream peer-reviewed scholarship. Everything that follows is an exploration of those claims as they exist in secondary research literature, not a presentation of established historical fact. Before we go further, if this kind of historical and archaeological exploration is what you're here for, subscribe now. Every week this channel examines the texts, tablets, and interpretive debates that sit at the edges of mainstream scholarship. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. To place this claim in context, it helps to understand what is and is not established within mainstream scholarship about how ancient Mesopotamian texts treat human lifespan. What is not in dispute, the Sumerian king list, a genuine and extensively studied document held across multiple collections, including the Ashmolean Museum, records reign lengths for early rulers that are extraordinarily long, figures in the tens of thousands of years for the earliest kings, before dropping to more conventional figures after a flood narrative described in the text. This is a real, documented feature of a real ancient text. Mainstream Assyriology generally interprets these numbers as symbolic, tied to the base 60 numerical system the Sumerians used, rather than as literal biographical claims. That is the scholarly consensus. What has been debated, in a much smaller body of alternative research, is whether other surviving texts describe a deliberate transition, a point at which lifespans were intentionally reduced from an earlier, longer standard to a fixed, shorter one, and whether that transition is described as a decision rather than a natural change. It's worth being direct about the comparison many alternative researchers draw here. A commonly cited figure of 120 years appears in other ancient Near Eastern flood-related literature as an upper limit on lifespan, a detail widely known and discussed across multiple cultural and religious traditions. This documentary does not engage with or evaluate that comparison, since it sits within frameworks of belief that this exploration is not designed to assess. What we are examining here is a separate, narrower claim, a specific, lesser-known Sumerian administrative-style text proposing a number closer to 100, and a different explanatory frame for why that number was chosen. With that distinction established, here is what tablet SH1107 is claimed to contain. The researcher most often credited with the first sustained translation work on SH1107 is identified in secondary accounts as Dr. Marcus Feldman, described as an independent Akkadian specialist who had previously worked on contract translation projects for the Iraq Museum before relocating to a research position in the United States. His academic affiliations and the specific timeline described below have not been confirmed through independent institutional records. According to this account, Feldman first encountered the fragment in 1975 while reviewing unpublished materials from the Shuruppak excavations as part of a broader survey project. He reportedly noted that the fragment was badly damaged on two edges, with roughly 40% of the original text missing or illegible, and that what remained used vocabulary that did not match standard administrative Sumerian. The difficulty, he reportedly wrote in working notes that later circulated privately, was that the surviving text combined two registers that should not have appeared together: the precise, numerical, almost bureaucratic phrasing, typical of ration lists and tax records, applied to a subject, the duration of human life, that in every other surviving Sumerian text is addressed only in mythological or poetic language. Feldman reportedly spent close to 4 years attempting to reconstruct the damaged sections using comparative vocabulary from other Shuruppak-era texts, a method he described in his notes as necessarily speculative given the extent of the damage. He is said to have completed a working translation in 1979 and circulated it to a small number of colleagues for review, rather than submitting it for formal publication, reportedly because he considered the reconstructed sections too uncertain to present as a finished academic translation. That working translation and the notes accompanying it are what subsequent researchers have drawn on. None of this has been independently confirmed through mainstream academic channels, and no formal peer-reviewed publication of Feldman's translation has been identified in mainstream Assyriological literature. According to the proposed translation, this is what the fragment claims. The surviving portion of the text, per this interpretation, does not open with a narrative framing in the way SH4429 style tablets in other contexts are said to. There is no named scribe, no claimed chain of custody back to sealed originals. The text instead begins, according to Feldman's reconstruction, in the middle of what appears to be a list of considerations, weighed one against another, regarding what the text calls the span granted to the formed ones, a phrase Feldman translated cautiously, noting that formed ones is a term that appears elsewhere in Sumerian texts in contexts describing the creation of human beings through deliberate construction rather than natural birth. The considerations listed, per the proposed translation, include observations about what would happen if the span were left unset. The text reportedly states that, without a fixed limit, the formed ones would accumulate knowledge without end, accumulate authority without end, and eventually require resources without end. 3 consequences the text lists in sequence, each one reportedly followed by a short clause Feldman rendered as, "and this could not be permitted to continue." It is worth pausing here to note what mainstream scholars would observe about this kind of framing. The idea of immortality or excessive longevity being deliberately curtailed because of its destabilizing consequences is a recurring motif across many entirely unrelated mythological traditions worldwide, and is frequently read by scholars of comparative mythology as addressing a universal human anxiety about mortality, rather than describing a specific historical event. Whether SH1107 fits that broader pattern or represents something distinct is a question this documentary does not resolve. According to the proposed translation, the text then states a number. The number, per Feldman's reading of the damaged passage, is repeated in 3 different contexts across the surviving fragment, each time rendered with the same numerical sign. Feldman reportedly cross-checked this sign against known Sumerian numerical notation, and concluded it most likely represented the figure 100, though he noted in his working papers that damage to the tablet's surface at each occurrence introduced some uncertainty into this reading, and that an alternative reading was not entirely ruled out. This uncertainty is significant and should not be minimized. The central claimed number in this entire account rests on a damaged, reconstructed reading that its own translator described as not fully certain. The text, per this interpretation, attributes the decision to set this limit to a specific party, referred to not by a personal name, but by a title, Feldman rendered as the keeper of the measuring cord. This phrase, he noted, appears in other genuine Sumerian administrative contexts in reference to officials responsible for land surveying and the allocation of resources, a real bureaucratic role tied to measurement and boundary setting, well documented outside this disputed text. Feldman's proposed reading suggests the text is using this familiar administrative title metaphorically, applying the language of land measurement to the measurement of a lifespan, the same figure who determines how much land a household receives, in this reading, also determines how much time a life receives. He described this in his notes as, in his words, the most internally consistent reading I could construct, though I want to be clear, this is interpretation, not translation in the strict sense. That caveat, present in Feldman's own working notes, according to those who have reviewed them, is important context that is often dropped when this material circulates in less careful retellings. Some researchers who find this translation compelling have proposed that the keeper of the measuring cord refers to a singular authority figure within the broader Anunnaki framework discussed in other Sumerian texts, though it should be stated plainly that this identification does not appear explicitly anywhere in the surviving fragment itself. It is an inference built on top of an already uncertain translation, and it has no support within mainstream Assyriology. The final surviving section of the fragment, per the proposed translation, addresses what the text frames as the reasoning given to the formed ones themselves for the new limit, though this section is reportedly among the most heavily damaged, with Feldman estimating that less than a third of the original text in this portion survives in legible form. What can be reconstructed, according to this reading, suggests the limit was framed not as a punishment, but as what the text calls a kindness in the shape of an ending, a phrase Feldman translated with particular hesitation, noting that the underlying Sumerian could plausibly support several different emotional registers, depending on how a damaged determinative sign is read. It is worth being transparent here. This is a passage where the translator's own documented uncertainty is high, and where the proposed meaning shifts significantly depending on choices that cannot currently be verified against the original clay. Presenting this passage with more confidence than its own translator held would misrepresent the state of the evidence. It is worth pausing here to separate clearly what is genuinely established from what remains claimed and contested. What can be independently verified? The Sumerian king list is a real, extensively studied document, and its treatment of extraordinarily long early reign lengths, followed by a sharp reduction, is a documented and discussed feature within mainstream Assyriology, generally read as symbolic rather than literal. Shuruppak was a real Sumerian city, and genuine excavations there in the 1920s did recover large numbers of administrative tablets, many of which remain understudied. The role of measuring cord officials in Sumerian land administration is real and documented outside this disputed text. What has not been independently verified? The specific existence and content of fragment SH1107 as described here. The identity, career, and translation work of Dr. Marcus Feldman. Any of the specific translation content presented in this documentary. None of these claims appear in peer-reviewed Assyriological literature in the form described. What remains genuinely open? Whether a fragment matching this description exists in the form claimed, whether independent access could confirm or refute the proposed reading, and whether the central numerical claim, itself acknowledged by its own translator as uncertain, would survive rigorous re-examination. These questions have not been resolved. They are noted here not to suggest the account is true, but to give an honest picture of what is known, what is claimed, and the distance between the two. What is worth holding on to, regardless of the specific and unverified claims explored here, is a genuine and well-documented historical reality. Ancient Mesopotamian cultures did grapple, across multiple real and thoroughly studied texts, with questions about mortality, the contrast between divine or extraordinarily long lifespans and human ones, and the meaning of a bounded human life. That is not speculation. It is a central, recurring theme across the authentic literary record of the ancient Near East, and it remains an active and legitimate area of scholarly study. Whether fragment SH1107 adds anything genuine to that record, or whether it represents a reconstruction built on too much uncertainty to support the claims made about it, is a question that would require independent access to the original material and rigorous peer review to settle. Until then, the question remains open. And open questions, examined honestly, are where understanding begins. Next week, a Babylonian administrative tablet is said by some researchers to describe a constructed mechanism positioned beneath the earth with maintenance instructions implying ongoing operation. We examine the claim against what is actually known about ancient Mesopotamian engineering. Subscribe so you don't miss it.